GHP provides insurance for hospice and home care agencies, as well as senior living organizations. Betty, we are thrilled you're with us. Take it away.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll tell you thank you for the applause. I'll tell you a little bit more about myself in a minute, but I first want to talk about the title because I know it goes with the theme, and I was actually glad to hear that some of you requested the topic because, you know, usually when you talk workers' comp, people are walking out the door. But I saw the title, Impossible, and I'm thinking, it just doesn't work for my career because we have to believe that everything is possible. You know, we can drive down the expenses and the cost, and we can make a difference in this area. So that's my disclaimer for the title. I was talking to a few people during the social hour yesterday, and I was like, what is the group like? And someone suggested, well, maybe ask a few questions. So I wanted to, how many of you have what you would consider direct responsibility for the workers' comp function? Okay, so not too many have direct. How many of you are involved in safety overall for the organization and patient safety, employee safety, those roles? Okay, a little bit more. How many of you come from hospices that are around 50 census? Okay, I knew I had one because I talked to you last evening. How about 50 to 200? Okay, a lot more of those. And larger than 200 to 500? Okay, we have a good mix here then. So what I find in going into organizations, really for any type of risk, a lot depends on your size, on the various responsibilities that people have in the organization and the resources that you can apply to what you're doing. So a little bit more about my background. With Glatfelter for the last 14 years, we do have a program that addresses all risks. So as Hall mentioned, it's the driving. Driving is, and I'm going to talk a little bit more here later about how the auto exposure overlaps from just auto to workers' comp as well, because we can have employee injuries related to that. But we're looking at property, we're looking at patient care related risks, we're really looking at the total picture. And I find a lot of those are addressed, but workers' comp becomes more of a making sure we're reporting the way we should. We're not really looking at it as an area for risk management or quality improvement. I'm going to talk about that a little bit at the end. So to start the story off, when I was given this subject and I was thinking about it, actually the evening after I had dinner with Hall, I went right home and did an outline for what I wanted to talk about. And one of the things I thought about it, I'm a daughter of a white collar union person. And I remember when I first started work, my father saying to me that sick time and workers' comp are there if you need them. They're not necessarily a benefit that you have to use. And it always was something that I thought about when I became a manager in the hospital, that, you know, it's something that can be controlled. And the benefit is the reason why unions started all these benefits was to protect the safety of the worker. So that's really what our goal is, to keep people from being injured. And then if they do get injured, to protect them down the road. So an example I'll give from my career is I started in nursing, as Hall mentioned, in the late 70s. And I was working at an inner city Baltimore hospital where there were issues already with IV drug abuse. Hepatitis was an issue, of course TB was an issue, and we had cardboard needle boxes. Does anybody remember those days? And not only did we have cardboard needle boxes, but people kept jamming them in there because nobody got rid of the old needles. And then this strange disease hit town where people were dying and we didn't know why. And that was before we figured out what AIDS was. And so I'm working in this setting and we're getting all these needle sticks. And we're worried because we know we have something going on. We also have nurses and housekeeping staff. Remember the housekeeping staff getting needle sticks because we didn't dispose of them correctly? And then they're unsourced needles. So then we came out with hard plastic needle boxes. we're figuring out we have a problem, we're taking another step, and we're trying to improve to make those changes and to protect our employees. And actually, I think it came about after I had left the nursing, the inpatient setting. We now have needleless systems. So we saw a problem, we tackled it, we made changes, and we improved things for our employees. And that's the mentality I think we have to have. Not that, I still go to places and I see that there's needle sticks. We haven't totally eliminated it, but we sure have made a difference. And how many of you have had to complete employee incident reports yourself? Okay, how many of you probably should have one time and didn't because you were embarrassed by what happened? Any of those? I had one of those actually. But on my very last day as a clinical nurse before I transitioned into the insurance industry, I went into the dirty utility room and we had re-sterilizable cut-down trays at that time. And somebody had left the drape all over there in the sink, and I'm trying to clean it up, and I pick up the drape, and I get a needle stick, my very last day. And I held on to that incident report forever because I wasn't sure what was going to happen. Thank the Lord that I avoided any transmissible diseases. But so are we in a risky business? We're in healthcare. We are definitely in a risky business, and I'll give some stats later. I did ask Seth, and he told me that after the conference you'll get all these slides, because in my slides I actually put some links to some resources that are out there, all free. There's a lot of good government resources that are free that can be useful in. I was listening to Hall before we started. He said we don't want a sage on a stage to give our presentations. We want someone that has experience. And I will say that I can't tell you the whole OSHA reporting guidelines and every step of what you have to do. I unfortunately come in and try to help with managing the risks. So we lift and move people, and I heard a lot about back injuries. That's probably the most frequent, and that's what the statistics are going to show for your industry. We're exposed, like I said, to bloodborne pathogens and infectious diseases. That was really, in my early days of nursing, the biggest risk that I experienced. I will say that, I'll talk a little bit about training, but I was very careful to watch the nursing assistants at the hospital and how they did body mechanics, because they knew how to move people without hurting their backs. And again, I'm really dating myself, but we didn't have the beds that went all the way down and came all the way up. We were really, if we got a patient out of bed, we were struggling to get them back in. And then, of course, OSHA and Department of Labor stats will tell you that. So here's some of those stats, and here's one of the links I was talking about. So more workers are injured in the healthcare and social assistance industry sector than any other. And I thought this was really, really interesting. We kind of have a sense of that, but we might think, okay, so firefighters are out there all the time in risky positions, and police officers are, but more workers are injured in healthcare and social assistance than any other. And nursing assistants, or as most of us call them, home health aides, are among the highest occupations with the highest rates of musculoskeletal disorders. And that was interesting to me. So the rate is 166.3 compared to an average rate of 30.5. So we're not wrong in thinking we have a problem, and we definitely have an exposure. We need to look at that. So I looked a little further, and it was interesting to me that in a study done in 2015, occupations resulting in the highest number of days away from work after an injury, the highest three were heavy and tractor trailer truck drivers, stock and material movers. I don't know if any of you have mentioned, there's been a lot in the news about Amazon and the warehouses and the injuries in those settings. So that was one. And nursing assistants again. So, we really need to look closely at how we're protecting our employees in that regard. So do we take workers' comp seriously? Little word cloud here. I wanted to ask, what do you think of when you think of workers' comp or employee safety? What are some of the things that come to mind? Any thoughts?
I want to share the stream because, 15 years prior, or 20 years of being in hospice prior, the last 5 years has seen 2 multiple shootings in the DFW market related inside of a hospice, where there was multiple lives taken. And so that's 25 years ago, you never had to think about something like that. But now, it's just nutty because it's happened twice, in the last 5 years. So sort of a new twist on.
And I
safety.
have that to talk about in the security aspect later on in the talk. But yeah, that's definitely something to consider. And I noticed when I got this topic, it seemed like everywhere around me I was hearing about workers' comp related injuries. And I was even at the airport, I was on my laptop, and across from me was a woman who was either an attorney or a claims adjuster who was trying to explain to her client why they lost a workers' comp case because of a pre-existing condition. So, it's out there for everyone. The reason I put this slide up is I think we need to look at the idea of our culture as an organization. One of the things that I felt real strongly about when I was a manager is having conversations with the staff is about, I don't want you to injure your back because you'll be a workers' comp. I don't want you to injure your back because you'll have that back injury for the rest of your life. I want you to be a healthy, whole person and not have to deal with that. So I think one of the things that we need to look at, and I asked, these are the questions we should be asking. Look at our organization and see, what is our culture? Do we value employee safety and wholeness and try to prevent injuries from that perspective versus we got this bad workers' comp. First of all, I don't want you to wait until you have a bad workers' comp mod to start thinking about it. But look at, whether your employees really believe that you're there to help them and to keep them from being injured. So how many of you have wellness programs in addition that look at those kind of things? You have a good bit of that now, good. Because I know, sometimes if you're smaller, it's hard to invest resources into something like that. But to me, that's a risk management tool that helps in the future. I talked about, a lot of free resources out there. This is just a simple poster that I found when I was putting this presentation together, that a safe workplace doesn't happen by accident. We all have to be thinking about that. The hard thing I think for home health and hospice is you have an uncontrolled environment. And so you have, I always thought this was interesting when I did my home care rotation when I went back for my BSN. If it was what they considered an unsafe neighborhood, they sent 2 of you. That was the way to protect you. And I know eventually what they did was they started having escort services and all that. But back when I was doing that, they sent 2 of you into the unsafe neighborhood to see if we didn't get any training in how to evaluate and assess for risk and safety. We were sent out. So we do have to put some thought into this area for our employees' sake. So, when you have an employee incident and you fill out the employee incident report, what happens to those? In your organization, is that a human resource function totally for most of you? Yes. So that incident report goes to someone in HR and they look at it. How many of you require some kind of investigation of every incident? Okay, most of you do, that's good. And is it HR that does that investigation? It's you are you a manager or, okay. All right, so that's what I'm going to emphasize in a little bit is having a formal process for a supervisory investigation of, I think, every employee incident and even some near misses if it could have been catastrophic. So here's some of the questions you should ask in doing an employee follow-up investigation. Who was involved? Were there any witnesses? Actually, some of the same questions you would ask as part of a patient incident investigation. Who was involved? Who were the, are there witnesses? Where and when did this occur? What were the injuries? What was the employee doing? And I have an example for this that still blows my mind. It was an employee, a home care employee. She was actually a physical therapist who was going between homes, and she said, I had gotten in the habit of multitasking when I'm, out there and about. So I'm going to eat lunch while I'm driving between patients' homes. And lunch was yogurt. So she's driving the car and she goes to pull that foil top off the yogurt and the wheel turns. She ended up rolling her vehicle into a ditch. Now, she didn't hit anyone else, and she actually walked away from that incident with just minor cuts and scratches. But there's two good things that came out of this, I think. In that particular case, she was willing to admit what she had done and what caused the accident. She then wrote a letter to her organization that they put in their employee newsletter saying about how, she just hadn't thought about how unsafe that was, that she used the terminology at the time about she was operating a vehicle that was like a speeding bullet, and, and when she lost control, what could have happened. So they use that as a teaching moment within their organization. I think the important thing to remember there is, and I will say myself, because I drive a lot for work, sometimes you do take shortcuts, or you think, oh, I can do this real quick, I can look at my phone real quick, I can do that without causing any problems. And that one moment of lapse, God knows how many yogurts she had opened up prior to that, you just don't know that. So I think that's really important. Another thing, as part of the investigation, you should ask is, were appropriate procedures being followed? And then lastly, could anything have been done differently to avoid this? And as someone who has reviewed a lot of incident reports over my career, one thing that always blows my mind is when you read the incident and you know clearly that the policy wasn't being followed. A big one back in the day was recapping of needles after they had changed that procedure. And you ask, what could have been done differently? And they say, nothing. Nothing. And that really shows me that that's just an automatic process and you're really not taking it seriously. So I would advise you to, when you go back to your organizations, to look at what are we really doing when we have an incident and how seriously are we taking it? And can we avoid these from happening? If there's in a situation where they should have used proper protective equipment, that's something to consider. And that I usually preface most of my talks, I knew this was going to be about workers' comp, but auto liability is the biggest loss leader in the home care and hospice arena because of people driving their vehicles all times of day, all kinds of weather all over the country. And when you're investigating a motor vehicle accident, there's a lot more that you should be looking at to make sure that, they did the appropriate things. Most organizations will do drug tests post-accident. So make sure that you're going through all those steps. So I can say, since we do both, that these are the two areas where I would say an exposure from a professional liability perspective and from a workers' comp perspective can overlap. The first is the back injury that we talked about, which is so frequent in this area. And the reason I mentioned that as also a PL exposure is because if you look closely, most of the back injuries occur when they're trying to transfer a patient. And they're about to drop the patient, they go to save them, and that's when they hurt their back. So sometimes we'll get a patient injury and we get the employee injury. And then the second is the driving, because any of you have fleets? Fleets for your staff? A couple of you say yes. Okay, so we got, the auto physical damage. We might have auto liability if they hit someone else. And then, just an airbag exploding can cause injuries. So we also have the potential for that. So that's something you have to look at. I was at an organization recently where I was trying to help them control the auto liability exposure. And I met with the human resource director to see, okay, what are you doing to screen drivers? You know, how are you following up on this risk? And I said, and by the way, do you have any open workers' comp claims related to that? So they not only had this big area of loss related to the vehicle, but they had workers' comp losses too, and they really weren't thinking of them as a combined area of exposure. So I was talking about how you don't have to be sophisticated in your training with employees. I went to a small VNA in Pennsylvania that had a hospice census of only about 35, I think. They also had some home health. And I saw these signs posted all through the hallways. One text or call could wreck it all. And what I found out when I was asking them about that is they have, as small as they were, of course in Pennsylvania you get a discount for having a safety committee, so on your workers' comp, so almost everybody has some kind of safety committee. But they had a topic of the month, and the last month had been on distracted driving, and they distributed these to staff and then they had them post it. And you know, I was like thrilled, because this is what it's all about, just constantly reminding people of the exposure that they might have.
Yeah, is that I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Is that probably the number one reason that people have wrecks? I don't know what it is, whether it's weather conditions, whether it's just whatever. Is it texting?
Distracted driving, I think, is what, it's so hard to really define unless a person is open with you about what caused the accident.
I just didn't know if there's national statistics on cause of wrecks.
Well, the
'Cause
Department
I'm
of Transportation, yeah, the Department of Transportation does have some statistics out there on it. But again, you know, I'm thinking it's probably even higher than what the stated statistics are, because people don't tell the truth all the time about that. But it is a big one for our workers, because do any of you have cell phones that deactivate and they can't text while they're moving in a moving vehicle? There is some technology out there that you can do that now. I've seen a few organizations do that. But in most cases, you know, they might need the address of their next visit. There's a lot of reasons why they're really tied to that phone. And I think we actually piloted a driver monitoring system phone application at the office. And I found it really did improve my driving practices. I just kept my phone in my purse the entire time. I didn't touch it. You know, I'm off the pilot now, and can I say I've really totally kept with that? No, but I'm much more aware of what a risk it is, and try to avoid that. Do any of you not have a safety committee? Okay, you all have some form of safety committee. I just want to mention, you know, I think a lot of times our committees become just something we do, and we all get together and, you know, we follow the agenda, and we're not really looking for the value in that. And some of you have to sit on every committee in the organization, so it gets frustrating. To me, there's real value in the safety committee, because if we have open conversation and communication about what the risks are, it's not just somebody reporting it out. This is what we had the last month, and we just go right on to the next. It's people asking questions and communicating. There's follow-up, as your QAPI committee would have. There's follow-up to whatever is discussed at that meeting. Hopefully nothing will fall through the crack if you have that situation. And again, I go back to, we learn from our mistakes. We don't keep repeating the same, or it might be a one-time thing. As I mentioned, you know, your ears perk up when you're getting ready to do a presentation. And I was in Pensacola last week, and the woman told me she was a hospice unit director, but she also did some hemodialysis. She said, one time I was going to remove one of the needles, and I put pressure on that site where the other needle was located. It went right through her finger as she was putting pressure. She said, okay, I thought about that, and okay, now I don't put needles in the same way. So she learned from that mistake. And I can send, I don't think I attached to my minutes, but I can send a sample agenda on that too. This is one of the links I have. There's actually very specific information out there on the risks in home health care, particularly. So those are some of the links for that. And I found this was wonderful for employee training. NIOSH has all these fact sheets that you can use for training of your staff. Unsafe conditions, driving-related injuries, needles, sticks, and sharps, latex, musculoskeletal disorders, violence on the job, and caring for others while caring for yourself, or caring for yourself while caring for others. I don't think we think about that enough. I did put in my email in case people had questions about anything, but I really, what I want to end up with and go back to at this point is, this is something I believe that if we take it seriously and we really put our effort into it, we can control our workers' comp losses and really more so, value the safety and health of our employees. It shouldn't be set off by itself. I was curious when I asked, who has some role in the workers' comp. A lot of times it is just HR. And it really shouldn't only be an HR function. It should be multidisciplinary. And do any of you actually have thresholds or QAPI indicators for workers' comp related things? I think that's something to consider. I mean, a lot of organizations will have HR have quality indicators, but they might not be about the workers' comp function. So that's something to consider. And to me, having a functioning, a really positive safety committee is a positive for the organization. So that's what I have prepared, but I'd be glad to answer any questions about workers' comp or any other risks that you are concerned about.
I have a question, or really for all of us. It seems like with personal injury attorneys, there's a growing attention to personal injury and workers' comp. Are y'all seeing that? Because the folks that wanted this as a topic, that seemed to be driving it, that our culture was moving to a more litigious, hoping to be injured for the big payday, right? So how do you guard against that if you're a hospice with your own staff? That was kind of driving some of this question. What have we seen work in the last year? Is it growing, or is that just me hearing it's growing? Are your workers trying to win the lottery by getting hurt?
Well, the billboards are up there for sure.
Yeah, it's obviously
but
there.
That's why I had the slide on and talked about culture a bit, because it is easy, and I have had some organizations say if you have one person go out on workers' comp and they might have a close friend who feels like they have an injury and it becomes a snowball. So I have seen organizations that have dealt with having a couple people out, at the same time because of that. But and I would say that senior living would probably be thrilled if the attorneys were going after you instead of senior living. But
one thing I've seen, and does anybody do this? Does anybody have your employees sign a document saying they won't text while in a moving vehicle?
I've seen that at a lot.
I mean, about any hands? Is it half, a third? Okay. I mean, those are the kind of things I think that we as a hospice group are going to have to see what are best practices. So during the next year, let's let Sono kind of go through some of this and try to distribute what we see as best practices. Because sometimes when I was asked to find a great insurance company that addressed this and found Glatfelter, I found that a lot of us use our local agents that might be great at property casualty, but they're not as great as with the unique needs that hospices have. So use these guys as a reference if you want to. They become friends. And if nobody has another question, anybody got another question?
I do kind of have a question about the role of the workers' comp company in assisting you with any of the...
I was just going to say that because I think that's a key, is knowing what your resources are. And so because there are areas that overlap, like just last week I was at Kathy's organization and met with the HR director, and he said, interestingly, our workers' comp carrier thinks this is the biggest area of risk as well. We all have resources, so know you know, whoever your training person is in the organization, make sure they know what training resources are out there. And for the areas that I talked about, well, like the musculoskeletal injuries and the driving, free government resources are out there, including some videos. Did any of you see, it was like viral, I think a couple years ago on social media, about the state police officers showing what directional signals were for and how they worked. I think showing simple little things like that to your place when you're doing a driver safety training will get people laughing, but thinking about what they're doing when they're out on the road. So it doesn't have to be all dry material. I think we can put some fun and humor into what we do for training purposes. But there is a lot of free stuff, and your workers' comp carrier should have a lot for you as well.